episode this week, and I know there's probably a lot of
One thing that really made well about you is that I taken time out of an insane film. On this episode of Unbeatable, I'm going to invite you into a conversation that I had the privilege of hearing just a few years ago. And to be honest with you, when I heard it for the first time, I remember thinking to myself, there's no way, this absolutely could not have happened, because what I'm hearing from these children of these two soldiers never, ever, ever happens. I want you to hear a conversation between Don Malarkey's daughter, a paratrooper from the Band of Brothers in World War II, and Fritz Engelbert's sons, a German soldier who was on the other side of the Battle of the Bulge as they fought against one another in World War II. It's not the battle, it's not the bullets that are going to blow your mind. What will blow you away is what happens 60 years after the battle. Stay tuned for the Saving My Enemy conversation on this episode of Unbeatable. Before I get into this incredible, amazing conversation with these three, I want to remind you about the Solomon Foundation. These folks are committed to helping the local church grow, and if you will partner with them, they're going to give you an excellent return while you make an eternal impact. So if what I'm saying sounds interesting to you, why don't you go check them out at thesolomonfoundation.org. And now, let me turn things over to Matthias, Volker, and Marianne as they describe what happened with their fathers 60 years after the Battle of the Bulge. Check it out.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for joining me from all over the world for this very special episode of Unbeatable. Marianne, thanks for tuning in all the way from Oregon, from the Portland area. Is that right?
Yep, we're an hour south of Portland, Salem.
Yeah, and Matthias and Volker, you're joining us from Germany. Can you give the listeners, some of them who live in Europe, a general idea of where your homes are in Germany?
Now we are talking, you watch us in Bonn on the Rhine,
Okay.
South of Cologne. We are sitting now in my home, and Volker is just 5 minutes.
Yeah, 3 miles away or so.
Down the river, 5 minutes towards Cologne. That's where Volker. Yeah. So we live close together.
Yeah.
Well, when the guests start to learn a little bit about your father, a lot of what they're going to hear today, especially anyone familiar with the military, is going to sound very familiar. I want to give a lot of credit before we even get into the conversation today to Andreas Reinhardt, who is the reason why I had a chance to meet the three of you in person. Andreas, if you're watching this episode, you're awesome. Thank you for connecting all of us in Switzerland a few years back. Guys, your fathers both took part in one of the most brutal and one of the biggest military operations of all times. Your fathers took part in Operation Overlord, or the D-Day invasion, on opposite sides of the war, Germany and the United States. And your fathers were both not individually, but very well depicted in the miniseries Band of Brothers. Of course, Marianne, your father, Don Malarkey, was very well depicted throughout the entire miniseries. But Matthias, Volker, your father, Fritz, was depicted just not by name in this miniseries. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stop talking in just a second, and I'm going to let you guys describe what I had the privilege of hearing firsthand from both of you when your fathers reconnected years later after the D-Day invasion was over with. But in order for people to hear just how incredible that interaction was, and really how life transforming it was, let's talk a little bit about your father, Matthias Volker, either one of you. What was he doing before the Western Front developed? What was he doing before he ended up in the army?
So our grandparents had a guest house in the little town where we were born, Hilchenbach, and so he was helping out in the guest house. Our grandmother was cooking, and our grandfather did the service and so the preparation. So they were running a guest house and a pub, let's say. And our dad, Fritz, was helping, but he went to school, and he was on we call that höhere Handelsschule. So he was ready to become a merchant, and he learned languages, Spanish and English on that höhere Handelsschule. So he really wanted to become. He wasn't keen on taking over the pub and the guest house. So he was really a little bit reluctant, and he would have loved to become a lawyer or study jurisdiction. That would have been his dream. But I think the compromise with his parents was you get a real education as a merchant, then you can take over the guest house, but forget about becoming a lawyer. But so our dad was born in 25. So when Hitler and the Nazis took over, he was 8, and he never heard anything else than the Nazi propaganda. And being an only child, he always wanted to be, let's say, part of a group and belong to a group. And so he couldn't wait to become a Hitler Junge, and that was not what our grandparents wished. Especially our grandfather. So Fritz's father, he was a social democrat, and he was so against Hitler and the Nazis, but he couldn't do anything. They couldn't prevent their son or keep their son. He was just, indoctrinated by the brown shirts, by the Nazis, and so that was the path he was following, and so he ended up becoming a soldier in August 43. That was when he was 18, and he couldn't wait to become a soldier because he really thought he would be fighting for a good cause, and he didn't know any better at that time. Although his parents said,
our grandfather always said Hitler will lead us into misery and everything will become worse, and it's a great problem for Germany. But he couldn't say it loud, because if you say something like this, they take you and put you into a concentration camp.
Right.
So it was a permanent quarrel between my father and my grandfather, because they always argued against each other. And to think about the thing with the Jewish neighbor. My grandfather had a Jewish neighbor, a butcher, who was his family immigrated to the USA. And
now live in Kansas, and he
stayed.
Them.
He stayed, and he had to close his shop and couldn't do something for a living. And so at night or in the evening, when it was dark, he came to my grandfather's house, and he gave him food and supported him.
And cigarettes.
And my father was upset. Why do you feed that Jew? And so that was a real problem. Normally he must have reported my grandfather. He did not. But I think he was
he was really in trouble, because he thought the NSDAP, the Nazi party, said you have to report your own parents, but he just couldn't do that. But officially, it would have been his duty to report my parents support a Jewish neighbor, and so that was really a horrible situation, horrible times. But luckily, he didn't report that. But so Seligman Honi was his name, and our grandfather and they were friends. They were both businessmen. Let's say one was running a guest house, and the other was one of the butchers in town. So they stayed close, but it was difficult.
Sure.
Not during the daytime.
Yeah. Thank you, by the way, for describing what life was like in Germany before September of 1939 and the invasion of Poland, because there was this groundswell of movement, and especially with the youth of Germany behind Hitler. By the time that World War I or World War II officially starts, the invasion of Poland, September 1939, at this point, there's a massive military, but after the invasion of Poland, it's not really an option anymore. If you're of fighting age, you're going to serve in the military, or you're going to prison, or you very well may die, which is where your father finds himself. Now, he volunteered and went willingly. It wasn't unwilling that he went. But when did he actually end up in France as part of the occupation during World War II? What time frame was this?
So I think he became a soldier in August 43, and the basic training was still in Germany. But then I think he was sent to Brittany. That was in spring of 44, because Rommel and the German soldiers were afraid the Allied troops would someday come and invade the coast in Brittany, and so he was in a town near Mont Saint Michel.
Yeah, you can see Mont Saint Michel behind.
Yeah.
And he helped to build up fortifications. What you saw later, these
bunkers and
the things they put on the beaches to
minefields.
The minefields. So he was.
The Germans called it Atlantic Wall, Atlantic Wall.
The Atlantic Wall. Sure.
So that was for a few months. He was there in Brittany, and I think when the invasion happened on D-Day, that was when he had been with his unit sent back to Germany, and maybe for a reorganization.
Yeah.
But then when after June 6th, he was among the troops that were sent to France to fight against the Allied troops. But we have one photo where I think they traveled for 2 weeks in a carriage in an open.
From Germany to France.
France, and they made a stop in Versailles. So there's a photo of him and 7 or 8 comrades standing in front of the famous castle of Versailles.
July.
In August.
Short before
August.
In August. It was shortly before Paris was free, was liberated.
And they were still sent further north to Argentan. So that was the closest that he ever got to the Allied troops advancing towards the west. I think on August 14th, he arrived and he reached the unit in Argentan. And at that time, was he already a part of the Panzerlehrdivision?
Yeah.
They were among those who tried to stop the Allies from moving further to the west. But from that day on, he always said it was only a retreat every day. So that was didn't change until December. Then when the Ardennen Offensive when that started, but till then around Paris, and so that was always they couldn't stop and they couldn't do anything and just try to save their lives and go back towards the east, towards Germany.
Yeah, I want to describe for the listeners what the situation was like in Germany, 1938, all the way through 44. You guys have described that. I also want to point out most military historians will tell you that your father served under one of the most brilliant military minds of all times, Erwin Rommel. But I want to turn the conversation over to Marianne for just a few minutes. Let's talk about your father and how he ended up in the United States Army. Again, at this point in U.S. history, almost everybody who was able to serve did, and many guys who weren't able to serve thought that their life was worthless and literally took their own lives because they felt ashamed of not serving. When did Don end up in the American military? When did he end up in the Army as a paratrooper in Easy Company of the 506th of the 101st?
So when Pearl Harbor happened, he was at the University of Oregon, which is in Eugene. And of course, they all heard that there had been a bombing over there, and he definitely felt the draw to go and actually to volunteer to go into the service. And so he tried to get into the Navy, the Marines. He could not get into either. He was able to get into the Army, and so that's when he enlisted into the Army. And he was then after that, he was able to go home really quickly, gather some things, say goodbye to his family, and then he was off to go up to Fort Lewis, which is north of us in Washington. And that's where he ended up finding out about the paratroopers. And he had read an article in Life magazine about the paratroopers, and he knew that it was experimental, but to him, it sounded really cool, that it was, he heard that paratroopers were, they were kind of going to have it easy. They weren't going to have the life that the men who fought, combat face to face. And so he kind of had a different idea of what it was going to be and what it ended up being. But he says in a video that I have that he would do it all over again. He would not choose to take the easy route anyway. So then, from there, he went to, Fort, we were there last year, you guys. What was it? Fort Bayou.
Yeah.
Yes. Went to Benning.
Fort Benning.
Yeah. And then from Benning up to Camp Toccoa.
Right. In the mountains of North Georgia, where he started to, prepare to get ready to go off to Europe, would have went to England and prepared for this, the largest invasion in human history. Most of the listeners who have any degree of military experience knows there's some very famous generals on the American side of the war as well, the Allied side of the war. But there's a few really, really famous soldiers. And your father, Don Malarkey, may be one of the most famous soldiers of the war just because of how well he was depicted in the miniseries Band of Brothers. I'm going to fast forward. I'm not going to go over the parachute jump into France before the Allied forces even hit the beaches. I'm not going to go over the fighting in the hedgerows, but both fathers end up going to battle against each other in some of the most brutal city to city, field to field, combat in really the history of the human race in the area of Bastogne, or as the French would call it, Bastogne. Marianne, why don't you go first and just let the listeners know a little bit of, you've had the chance to hear your father describe this. It's been depicted very well in the book and the miniseries, but can you go over a little bit of what your father experienced in those city fights, Caraton, Bastogne, other areas like that?
I think for me, the one that he talked about, excuse me, the most was Bastogne, because that was, in his opinion, the most meaningful battle that totally changed the course of the war for them. So what I would say is taking it years later, when I had the opportunity to go to Bastogne with my dad in 2001, we were over there for the world premiere party for Band of Brothers miniseries. We took a day and we went up to Bastogne. And when he walked into the woods, he stopped and he put his hand up on a tree, and he was getting very confused, kind of disoriented. And so I walked up to him and said, "Dad, what's wrong? Are you okay?" By the way, I'm filming the whole thing, so I have it all on film. And he was standing there seeing everything that happened there.
Wow.
It was
Reliving it.
all the visions, all the impressions that he had of the war were coming back all at one time. Now, that wasn't his first time back there. That was probably, I don't know, maybe his fourth or fifth time back there.
Uh-huh.
But I think having my mom there and having me there, it just all of a sudden hit him harder. And he 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 said when they were in Bastogne, and the coldest winter on record that they had had, they're
Yeah,
wearing their
sure.
they're wearing their summer gear. And he said he felt so good when he came out of that battle, even though he didn't eat well, didn't have enough water, just not great conditions. But he said, I felt the most healthy when I came out of there. And
Wow.
yeah, which is, it's really interesting because he, a lot of guys, they obviously they were all suffering. They had trench foot, and they had, you know, bladder infections, urinary tract infections, I mean, all this crazy stuff going on to them. And he said he was definitely better off when he came out of there. And another thing that he also talks a lot about when they were in Market Garden, and he talks about the Dutch and how they would cook for them, and they would bring it through the lines and somehow get food to them. And they just really appreciated the kindness of the
Yeah.
Dutch. The French were the same way. They were very, very kind to them. Obviously they were very happy that they were there and helping them in the war. But I think that's, for me, that's really the best way to describe it. He went through some really hard times there. He lost his best friend, and he lost another good friend, Alex Pincala. He saw other friends die, and then he also went through um, losing, when Buck Compton got pulled off, and he and Buck Compton were very close. And so it was definitely a difficult time of the war for him. And that's probably when that time of year, whenever it would come around, that would be the time of year that he would get really quiet. Instead of having one glass of scotch at night, he
Yeah.
might have two. So, always around the holidays, always around the first of the year. And I didn't understand when I was
Right.
young,
Yeah.
so it was something my mom had to tell me, just just let him be.
Well, the miniseries in the book describes, the D-Day invasion. It describes the house-to-house fighting. It describes the Battle of the Bulge in Bastogne and the Ardennes Forest really well. It doesn't talk about, and I'm glad you brought up, Operation Market Garden, that immense military operation in Holland to try to get to Nijmegen and secure that bridgehead across the Wall River that ends up becoming A Bridge Too Far and the movie A Bridge Too Far. But wow, your father was involved in all of it. I'll never forget, Matthias, Volker, listening to you two tell a story about your father and how the battle impacted him and what he saw. In fact, some of the, killing that he saw that stuck with him. So can either one or both of you describe your father's experiences before we get to this encounter? The whole reason we're doing this episode is the encounter years later, but I want people to understand what both of your fathers went through before we get to this encounter. So, Matthias, Volker, either one of you, can you talk about the kind of some of the things your father saw when he was on that Western Front.
So what he always told us as the most important or the most fierce situation that he encountered was his baptism of fire, was that first battle after the start of the Ardennes offensive. That was December 16th. They had been hiding on the German border, and so they were surprised for 4 days. The Germans could advance, and the American troops that were on the Belgium and the Luxembourg side of the border weren't ready for that. So they were not taken by surprise, not well educated and not very experienced. So the first 4 days, the Germans were able to advance, and it was only a problem with the tanks and with the equipment through the narrow, winding roads.
Right.
That sometimes there was a traffic jam, and they couldn't advance as fast as they wanted to.
And they were lucky because it was bad weather.
Oh yeah.
The American Air Force couldn't fly.
Right. And so
I want to jump in for just a second here and remind the listeners what happens for those 4 days is actually incredibly successful. Nobody expected Germany to be able to push back the Allies so quickly, so far. The fog cover made it almost impossible for either one of them to use air cover or air war. So what became known as the Battle of the Bulge is the German forces just pulling off the unimaginable and pushing back the Allies to the point that it looks like they're going to get cut off and totally surrounded. Your father's right in the middle of what many historians will consider the most improbable but successful, if not, everybody assumed this was insane and it's not going to work. And there was a moment where it almost worked to perfection. That's what your father's involved in during the Ardennes offensive. Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
Yeah, but that was very important because then for 4 days, the Germans, for the first time ever for our dad, because he had been retreating for months and months. So now they
were kind of enthusiastic.
Yeah.
So marching forward and all American soldiers coming up like this. They found, and my dad told us they found the American trucks filled with food, and the Germans had very bad food at that time, and so somehow the attack stopped for a moment because they had to eat the corned beef and open the tins and chocolate, cigarettes, so all what they find on those trucks. So. And they were somehow enthusiastic and said, okay, we're going on to Antwerp and we will win the war.
For 4 days. But then came, I think, December 19th. That was when Don, they were not jumping into Bastogne, but they were sent overnight on trucks and with the gliders. So the 101st Airborne was sent because the Americans just realized we have to stop that advance. And so the German side, our dad's company, they hadn't noticed that something had changed from 19th to the 20th of December. And the fiercest battle our dad always told us about was on December 20th. The morning they spotted a village and they wanted to, that was, if Bastogne was a clock, then it was at 5 o'clock, so southeast of Bastogne, very close to Bastogne, the little village called Marvy. And so our dad was as a messenger going back and forth on a motorcycle between units and transferring messages. And when he came back to his unit, his captain said, good, you're here, good, you're back, Private Engelbert, then you can go on this assault with us. Right. So they saw the little village there, and that was the last village before they would have entered Bastogne.
After Marvy was
so that was just, I don't know, 2 or 3 miles southeast of Bastogne. But the Germans didn't have the time to do any recon.
Yeah.
They didn't know what had happened during the night,
as I said, they were so enthusiastic. They said, "Okay, let's go on. We'll get them." But they were taken in half tracks,
Right.
in German Schützenpanzer, half tracks and four tanks, Mark IV, and a lot of half 10 half
so
tracks.
that it was 10 vehicles, 4 tanks in the front, and then 3 half tracks in the second row, 2 more half tracks in the third row, and 1 last half track at the very end, and that was the commander's half track. And our dad was riding as a messenger to the captain. He was riding in that last vehicle, and so advancing towards the village, they started firing at the village, and they destroyed houses there. 2 father with his daughter were killed within the first minutes when a house was hit. So they advanced, but then all of a sudden hell broke loose, because from their right side, Sherman tanks had taken position during the night.
There was a roadblock,
and so they were on a bit of a higher ground, so they were shooting down into the flank of the German tanks and half tracks, and so that was a real disaster for them. And our dad said that he could hear the tock 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 of the machine gun firing on the side of the half track, and the paint on the inside of the half track came off, and I think it was a terrible noise. And sometimes the half tracks were open
at the
so
top,
sometimes they could get up and peek above the railing, or how do you call it? So, but then they stayed down, and I think that was when our dad said he realized it's about life and death now, and so this assault was stopped, because 9 of the other vehicles, all other 9 vehicles were stopped, were shot and exploded, and some of the half tracks just couldn't move any further, and the soldiers had to get out and run by foot towards the village. But our dad, being in the last half track, the commander at the end realized he was the only vehicle that could still move, and so he decided, no, we won't follow them into destruction, and he gave the order, turn around and go back to the wood where they came from. So that was the reason why our dad survived that attack, and I think it was about 100 soldiers in 10 vehicles, and he was among the 10 that survived. But it was a complete catastrophe.
The whole company was done. There was only one half track left.
Yeah.
And this was true on both sides of the war. Out of hundreds of men, a handful of them survived. And the fact that both of your fathers made it through the war alive is just nothing short of the hand of God. I want to point out something for the listeners. There were several really intense battles in World War II on the Eastern Front, especially around Stalingrad. There were incredibly intense battles in the South Pacific from island to island. But what you two are describing right now, many people consider the most intense battle of the European front, with the American forces, the British forces in the European front of World War II, and your fathers are on opposite sides of it. Obviously, what happens to your fathers leaves a deep impact on them, and we don't have time to go over the rest of the war or how they were impacted by it. But the reason we're doing this episode is I listened to the two of you, 2 families who weren't there on the battlefield, but you were describing with detail like your fathers were, like it was coming directly from your father, what this battle was like. And you two were doing it right next to each other with this incredible relationship with each other, the Malarkey family and the Engelbert family. And I sat back and scratched my head and just said, How did this happen? How is it possible that two families from two different continents on opposite sides of World War II would be as close as you two families are? So I'll never forget you, the three of you, describing what happened when your fathers met each other again at a reunion many years later. Marianne, you've already said your father went back and forth there several times, but I would like Volker or Matthias, either one of you, to describe what it took to get your father to go back to France years after the war. Why does he even go there when he meets Don Malarkey for the first time after the war's over with many years later?
I think Matthias was, it's your turn. You were there from the beginning.
So that was 60 years after the war, and it was the anniversary of...
One more time for the listener. 60 years after the war is over with, your father is finally convinced to go back to where he fought the war. Sorry, keep going.
He got an invitation because he was on a mailing list of a Dutch journalist, and this journalist was in contact with the American troops, and so the 60th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge was coming closer. That was December 2004, and the American side, they knew 6 veterans from the United States. Compton, Don Malarkey, 50 Powers, and Wild Bill, they were coming. And the American side, or one guy on the American side, and the active soldier that was organizing the gathering, his name is Billy Maloney, and he had the idea, wouldn't it be a good idea to also invite German veterans to that meeting? When the American veterans come to celebrate the 60th anniversary, why don't we try to find German veterans to join the celebration, or just meet in peace? And it turned out that it was, our dad received a phone call and an email with an invitation. Would you like to come? And he was very, very reluctant. And
I was going to say, I already know this part of the story, but when he first got the invitation, of course, your dad is not really thinking about going. What convinced him to go back to this reunion 60 years later?
And I think we told him, Dad, you're suffering your whole life from the trauma from the war, and now you have a chance to meet somebody who was a former enemy, or maybe it makes a change or so. He wasn't convinced, and so we have to take him and come on. And so it happened. Huh?
Yeah, and we promised, and of course we wouldn't let him go all by himself. So we said that's a once in a lifetime chance. You have to go, and don't worry, we'll go with you, and we'll translate if necessary. So then he finally, and our mom also said she wasn't willing to go with him because she was also very. She experienced. They were all traumatized. That generation from the war, and she couldn't really. She didn't like, or she couldn't really talk about that, and so she was not able herself to go with him. But she motivated us, Volker and me, to go with Dad. So make him use that opportunity, and so we went to Bastogne, and it was great. It was, at the end of the day, he was also convinced it was a wonderful idea, but in the beginning
it didn't start out that way, right?
So easy. It really it took a lot of courage to go into the pub where we first met the Americans the evening before, and the first, I don't know if let's go into that one detail. The first thing that really happened when Dad and me, you came the next day, first evening it was Fritz and me, and we entered that bar, the pub near Frankfurt, and the Americans were already there, the 6 veterans, and they had the young soldiers taking autographs, and we realized, wow, that's really like movie stars. They were like movie stars, which we had no idea. But the first interaction, we sat down, Fritz and me, and had a beer, and but it took a few minutes till the first interaction happened, and the first thing that happened was Wild Bill looking at Fritz and saying, Fritz, German soldier? And we said yes, or maybe I think I said yes, my dad was a German soldier in the Wehrmacht. He also fought in the Battle of the Bulge. And the next thing Wild Bill said was, Fritz, you can count yourself lucky we didn't meet 60 years ago, because otherwise I would have killed you. So.
Well, I want Marianne to describe what happens next, but I need to narrate something for the audience for just a second. It is extremely unusual for two opposite sides of the battle to ever meet up. It doesn't matter if it's 6 weeks or 60 years later. It's very, very unusual. And in your father's case, in Fritz's case, because so much of the German culture and German society was invested in winning that war, after the war was over with, it wasn't just the trauma of all of the death and the destruction, but it was a dream for Germany that was absolutely ripped away from you. So what it took to convince your dad to go to Bastogne 60 years later is no small endeavor. I want people to hear that. But now what I want them to hear is what your father did, Marianne, when he met Fritz, and how this relationship started, because your father did something that a lot of American veterans would have never done. So would you describe what happens when Fritz and your father meet together in that pub?
Yes. So I wasn't there when they first met. So Matthias was there. And so everything that I know is from Matthias and my dad. But when Bill Garnier had said that he would have killed Fritz if it was 60 years, they were there 60 years ago together. Fritz backed his chair up, and he was not comfortable, and he felt like he probably should go.
Of course
and
not.
So,
yep. Sure.
Matthias, Dad, we're going to stay. Let's listen. Let's sit here. And then my dad could tell that he was not comfortable. And so my dad took his beer and stood up and welcomed Fritz into the band of brothers. And
all right. Hold on. I need everybody who's listening to hear this. You've got the guys from Easy Company that are back together again in France, having a reunion. Fritz is there, but very much on the sidelines. And your dad is hanging out with his buddies, his paratrooper buddies from World War II. When he gets up, and describe that one more time.
He stood up and held his beer up and said, "Welcome to the family. Welcome to the band of brothers." So it was, it was very, that's totally like my dad. That is the way he was. And not that I would say that Fritz is an underdog, but in that situation, he was the underdog.
Sure.
And my dad was always that way with people. If you were the underdog, he was going to be the one that was going to help you up. He was going to be the one to give you a hand, whatever it took to make you successful. And so I was not surprised that he did that. It's something that is, obviously very proud of him for doing that, because he's doing that in front of all of his comrades, which I'm sure that,
that took a lot of courage right there.
Yeah, it did. And not all of them probably felt the same way at that moment. I think later on, they did welcome Fritz, and he was definitely not an outsider, and he was definitely not an underdog anymore. He was definitely one of them.
After that, the next day he was sitting between Babe Heffron and Wild Bill, and they gave him a Easy Company tablet.
With the
autographs and so, yes.
Beim nächsten. Beim nächsten. So really later they all accepted him, and it was the souvenirs our dad received from Wild Bill. He's got a how do you call it, a coaster which you put under a beer glass.
Yeah.
So Bill wrote to Fritz, "Airborne love always." Also,
Right.
that is really like after that was he wrote that on the, let's say, 2 or 3 hours after his first remark with the, so that it really changed, and it also for Bill and probably the others. It took to meet face to face and see that that's not a monster. So they were all humans, and they discovered they had more in common than they probably thought before that meeting.
Anybody who's listening to this who's been to war knows exactly what your families are describing right now. But there are lots of people listening that have never been to war. They don't understand just how dehumanizing and how easy it is to turn the enemy into something that you never want to be around for the rest of your life. That's almost a necessity at some points in order for you to be able to emotionally and psychologically survive the trauma of what you're experiencing in war. So it doesn't matter if it's 60 years later. Many veterans want nothing to do with the war itself, even with their own buddies, let alone the people that were on the opposite side fighting against you. I'm saying this because the fact that Don would get up, walk across the room when his buddies are sitting there looking at Fritz, and there's still obviously got to be some hard feelings, and walk over there with a beer and invite him to become part of the family, air quotes, part of the band of brothers, is nothing short of incredible. I heard this story for the first time, firsthand from you three in Switzerland, and I was so moved by it that I am thrilled somebody, Bob Welch, decided we've got to put this story into print. I'm also really glad that Bob Welch entitled the book Saving My Enemy, because what I want people in this episode to hear is what happened to your father, Fritz, after that encounter, how much that conversation and then his relationship with Don changed his life. So either one of you, can you describe what happened to Fritz after meeting Don, after getting invited into the band of brothers, although he was on the opposite side of the Battle of the Bulge?
I think he first he couldn't believe what was happening, and on the next day they had a meeting in the forest, in Bastogne, and that was a special meeting because there were Belgian children from Belgian schools, and they were greeting the veterans. They had painted drawings and peace, la paix, and freedom. And my father, that was another problem for him. He said, "What will the Belgian people do if they see me?" I was one of the guys who burned their houses and shot their houses and killed their families. And will they say, "Fuck off, Nazi," or so, and will spit at me? And he was, the kids go to the American veterans and to German veterans, and my father was crying most whole of the most time. That was very special to him. And when he came back, he had, we noticed he found some peace. He found some peace. Huh?
Yeah, your father, like everyone who was fighting on both sides of the war, struggled with what they saw, with what they did. But in your father's case, I've just mentioned it already, dealt with the shame of buying into the Nazi, Nazi party lie, and then learning what he really was fighting for afterwards. But now I want to turn the conversation back to Marianne for a second. You've already described your father as the kind of guy who always roots for the underdog. So he's going to get up and hand Fritz a beer. But it could have ended right there. For most people, it would have ended right there. Why did your two fathers become so close, really, for the rest of their lives? What happened next that caused your two fathers to become so close that if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see right behind Matthias and Volker the picture of these two guys hanging out together like they're buds, even though they were on the opposite side of the war and ideologically opposite sides of the world for 50, 60 years. Marianne, how did this relationship between Don and Fritz grow so tight?
Partially, I think it's because they each understood each other on a whole different level than like obviously if you talk to me or if you talk to somebody else, when you have another soldier there, and they were together in a pub by themselves that evening that they first met with Matthias. Of course, Matthias was doing the translating.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, they both felt guilty for things that happened in the war. And my dad was really, really struggling with guilt for the amount of killing that he did. And Fritz had his own guilt that he was dealing with. And so what was so interesting to me is I don't really know how Fritz was, because I wasn't, it wasn't his child, but they put their hands on each other on the table, and that is not like my dad. My dad doesn't do,
Right.
like physical contact like that with another man, So it was something that if he did that, there was something there that
Something
they
special,
both,
right?
yeah. And what ended up happening those next few days, when I hear about it, when I think about it, it was almost like they were two college guys that were, just out having a good time together. And there was no, I can't think of the word, but, they weren't mad at each other for what had happened. That night in the pub, they gave each other forgiveness for what they did during the war. And that, I think, is something that my dad didn't even know that he was looking for. And his main concern when he got older was that he wanted to make sure he was going to go to heaven. And he really did not think he would go to heaven. He thought he was going to go to hell because of killing people.
All of the killing that he did. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so for them to sit there together and give each other forgiveness for their part that they had in a war is unthinkable. I mean, I just don't even know how you do that. You think about somebody that you've been mad at that has crossed you and done something wrong. I don't know if I could forgive them for what they did, but my dad, he was, like we said, it was 60 years later. He had been carrying this guilt around forever, and he wanted it to go away. And Fritz did that. Fritz gave him the ability to give forgiveness, and then for my dad to accept forgiveness from Fritz was huge.
The title of this book could not have been better. Saving My Enemy is what happened to both of your fathers 60 years later. It has really nothing to do with the Battle of the Bulge and the bullets flying on both sides of the war. It's what happens to your fathers. Matthias, Volker, your dad starts to act like a different man after meeting Don, and starts to become a very different man than he maybe would have been if he never went back to that reunion 60 years later. Can you describe a little bit of how this changed your father?
It was really, when we look at photos from before that meeting and after. Before that meeting, it was really hard. We don't have many photos of our dad Fritz where he smiles. So he sometimes, and he, after having a drink or a beer, sometimes he could also, he was humorous, but he was not an outgoing and not a funny person. But the photos we have from the three meetings with, so first, after that first meeting, there were two more meetings with Don, and then the third meeting we got to know Marianne. That was in Bastogne. Then again, the third meeting in 2007. But the photos of all these meetings, you can always see our dad is smiling from ear to ear,
Mhm.
and he was so relaxed, and we could tell on the way back after the first meeting, after coming back from Bastogne in December, then he was really. My wife also noticed the change in him when we arrived on that. I think we were in Bastogne on a Friday and came back on a Saturday. I don't know. So the next day, when we entered the house here,
Your mother
my dad
recognized
was a
he is a different
person.
man.
So it had changed. That you could really tell that was that gesture, that hug, the handshake he had been longing for such a long time. And so that is. Don't know if that's possible to see. He was to one of the drawings, the kids. So we took 20 or 23 of them. Fritz received, and we took them home. And so the kids already, and they were prepared.
The originals are bigger. This is
this is the original. Okay. But the kids they drew 3 flags. The German flag, the Belgian flag, and the American flag. And that was something that our dad just could not understand, that he was included in. So, and they said, no more war and all together. And the one had like he was already painting 2 soldiers in different uniforms.
Yeah.
One green, one red. Shaking hands, and so that was the gesture that really changed his mind and his whole setting. And from that day on, I think we never had a family gathering where he started crying. Right? It was, but before,
often.
Like Julia's confirmation, maybe you could tell.
When my oldest daughter had the confirmation, when she was about 14, we are evangelisch, that means Protestant.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a celebration in my house, and we're sitting at a coffee table, and my dad held a speech, and very soon he started speaking about the war, and he said, when I was in your age, 40 years old, I was in the Hitlerjugend, and started crying and couldn't talk anymore, and all the people, it was a funny party until that. And so the mood was gone. Everybody was thinking, what's going on? And so he couldn't speak for a minute or so. And my daughter was, what's wrong with grandpa? And that often happened on family occasions, so that he got in that mood, and that stopped after.
So after meeting Don and the veterans for the first time, it totally changed when war was one of the topics in a discussion. He was proud to tell the story that he had been to Bastogne, to the battlefield again, and that he had met a former enemy, and that they had shaken hands and forgiven. I don't know if did he talk about forgiveness? I think he felt it, but maybe he wouldn't have expressed it that way. But
it was important that everybody they could explain what happened. This happened to me. This happened to you, and I think they understood without words.
Yeah,
they couldn't. My father was not. His English was not very good, but he could a little bit. But I think they don't need too many words. I think they understood without words. And he was, when he said, my dad was never a hugger. He didn't hug me or didn't Matthias too much, but when I saw him hugging Don,
when you saw him hugging,
a wonderful picture of these. That's it.
There you go. There's a good picture for those of you who are looking online of Fritz and Don hugging each other, even though both of them would have grown up in a very different world where grown men didn't show that kind of affection.
No, and look at look at their heads are snuggled into each other.
Yeah, their heads are hugging on each other like they're best friends, like they haven't seen each other in like they're college roommates.
Yeah, it's my favorite. It's my favorite picture.
Really, that's a beautiful shot, Marianne.
I want to narrate something real quickly, and then we'll kind of bring this conversation to a close. I don't know if I told you three this, but I had the chance as an Army officer to take about 35 Army Rangers with me to the 65th anniversary of D-Day. And we were kind of the official representation of the Ranger force that was in the European theater. While we were there, of course, most of the big units of the Allies were represented, but there was also a German force that was represented there. And we all took part, all of the units, both sides of the war, in official ceremonies. But even after the ceremonies were over with and people got, out of their uniform and changed their clothes and went to a pub and gathered around a table, even then, the Germans were on one side of the room and the rest of the Allies on another side of the room. So when I was standing under a tree in Andreas's farm, listening to the three of you tell this story of your fathers, it blew me away. In fact, I'll just be honest, for a part of the conversation, I was like, no way, this doesn't happen. This couldn't happen. Nothing like this happens. But the more that I heard, the more that I was just absolutely in awe of both of your fathers. The way that they let their guard down, and you've already used this language, Marianne, forgave one another. And this isn't about winning or losing the war. This is about two men that are still struggling 60 years later with what they saw and what they did, and they need somebody to unload to. And they find the most unusual people imaginable. They find each other to unload to and become fast friends. So when I first heard this conversation, I was in awe of it. And to this day, this is one of those conversations that still sends goosebumps up my arm. I stood on the beaches of Normandy, France on June 6th. 65 years later, it made the hair on my arm stand up. And when I hear about Don and Fritz becoming such good friends after the war, it still makes the hair on my arm stand up, because this just never happens ever. So, man, you two had the privilege of seeing a side of your father that maybe you never would have saw if it wasn't for Fritz or if it wasn't for Don. And I kind of want to wrap up like this. At the end of this episode, I'm going to give away a free ebook copy of Saving My Enemy, Bob Welch's description of your fathers and what happened and how their lives were changed after this relationship. But I'll send it to Fritz or to Matthias and Volker first. Would you describe just a little bit of how much your life was touched by Don? And then Marianne, I want you to do the same thing about Fritz.
Yeah, for us, it was because we as the kids of a veteran, until then maybe I wouldn't have been able to say how much it was in ourselves and in us as kids, how much of the grief of our father, of our parents, we incorporated.
Yeah,
how much of that was in us.
You lived in the home under that, right?
Right. And so it was also such a big relief for me or for us. It's and I hadn't really expected such a change that was way beyond my wildest dreams, that it would have this impact. We only thought it will help, it will improve the situation, but It was a complete turnaround. So for us, it was the meetings with our father, with our parents. They were also much. The mood was very, very much light. It was lighter to be together, and because we had sharing these wonderful memories that nobody could take that away from us, and so that was always with us when we got together after that first day. And then when the second meeting in Illesheim in Bavaria was coming closer. We didn't have to convince our dad to go. He was right away.
Yes.
So it was, and my wife then joined us. So we were 4 when we met for the second time. So it was really, it was like a dream come true for me to see our dad in such a mood, and to see that amount of change in him. And so we tried to keep that memory alive in him as much as possible, because people tend to forget about the great things that we have experienced. And so that was, sometimes I really was afraid that he could ever forget. Wow, because with the ups and downs, sometimes it's hard to stay focused on those great moments. And that was one of the, I can honestly say, one of the greatest moments in my life too, and to be a witness of that happening.
And remember when Don wrote, he would come to Europe with his family.
Yeah.
And Fritz said, we have to go there with our family. And we said, you come. And so Matthias was there, and his wife, and me, and 2 of my daughters, and my Schwiegersohn, son-in-law. And so we all come, and for our father was absolutely important that from our family enough people would be there too.
Yeah.
We don't know how many Americans would come, but we said, we go there. Everybody who was able to go, we go there. No?
Yeah, it was really...
Well, and I have to interrupt, because at this moment, so this is 2007, we pull in one of the big coach buses, and my dad sees Fritz and his family standing there waiting for us, and he stands up. There they are.
That is awesome.
He was so excited, and we hadn't met yet, so I wouldn't know who they were. So, but he was just so excited, because he didn't know if they would actually come. It was like maybe they might not show up.
Well, Marianne, when I first met you three were like great friends together, and it just blew my mind. So could you describe for everybody just how your life was touched by Fritz as well?
So first, I need to say thank you to Jeff, because if you had not said that day, you need to write a book about this before someone else does.
It's that big of a deal to me. It really was. Yeah.
And we had no idea if this could be a book. And so when we came home, and I called Bob Welch, and we met for lunch, and I explained it to him, and he said, well, can I have Jeff's phone number? I would like to call him and talk to him about what he saw. And at that point, he was kind of lukewarm on writing the story. But after he talked to Jeff, he calls back and he said, I'm in, but we can't start for a few months. And I said, that's fine. That gives us some time to, get things figured out. But for me, how it has changed my life is two things. One, it changed my life as a daughter, to see my dad be able to have some comfort in his end of life, to know that he was forgiven, because that was huge for him. And I would have done anything to make that happen, but I had no idea until it happened. I had no idea what needed to happen. So it presented itself to us, and it was very impactful for him, but also for me, because I was the one that was with him day to day after my mother died. Having to live with his sadness. I mean, I can't explain how sad he was, and I wanted that all to go away. I just wanted him to be happy. And it just seemed like as he got older, it was even more, it's even more difficult for him. I think that because of being afraid that he was going to hell. But on the second side of that, the benefit for me was to meet a German soldier, learn obviously one story, one part of the story, but also to have gained such amazing friends as I have in Volker and Matthias, and they, even though they live a million miles away, they always, if we can make something work to meet up, we make it work. We were just together in Bastogne last month, and so the thing that, and like we were talking about with them growing up with their dad, they have the German side. I'm growing up with my dad on the American side, and that's, you hear how bad the Germans were, and then you learn that not all Germans were bad.
Right.
And then it's the same thing though. Yes, Americans did some great things and they saved, Europe and, everything, but there were some bad soldiers. There's bad Americans. So it's just nice to hear and to be with people that not only appreciate my dad's side, but they have so much humility on their dad's side. And we have just kind of, that friendship has just grown and tightened more than any of us, I think, could have ever realized, how it would be. So I was going to say, for my dad, to be able to end life and have that be a part of his story was great.
Well, I never got a chance to meet either one of your fathers, but I feel like I got to know them through the three of you. That to me was a gift. And I want to say thank you, the three of you, for letting me get a chance to know your fathers. But I'm even more impressed by your friendship, as you both, or all three of you, just described it, the relationship that your families have to one another now. You travel around the world to see each other, even though you weren't personally involved in it. The impact that Don and Fritz's relationship had on all of your families is just stunning. And I hope when people wrap this episode up with me today, they will think just how incredible this saving my enemy relationship between Don Malarkey and Fritz Engelbert was, and how much it's still in 2023 impacting families today because of the simple but very unusual or very rare gift of forgiveness that your fathers gave one another. So I want to say it one more time. Thank you, all three of you, for joining me from across 2 continents and many different time zones to be part of this episode. Thanks for sharing this story with the rest of the audience today.
Thanks for inviting us. Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure.
Yeah.
I hope the hair was standing up on your arms as you listened to what happened to their fathers after Don Malarkey got up, walked across the room, and handed Fritz a beer and said, "Welcome to the family. Welcome to the band of brothers," and how much their fathers' lives and even these 3 lives were touched by that moment. Hey, if you're wrestling with some stuff that you've gone through in the past, if you're struggling with forgiving somebody, why don't you let this episode be the catalyst that causes you to get up, walk across the room, and go talk to somebody, go have a conversation with somebody, so that you don't spend the next 60 years in turmoil on the inside like both Don and Fritz did. Thanks for joining me for this episode. If you stumbled across this broadcast for the first time and you really like what you're seeing in YouTube or love what you're hearing on your favorite podcast platform, why don't you go ahead and subscribe? If you haven't done it already, why don't you also follow us on social media, where we give you updates and more content from the Unbeatable audience? You're going to find some pretty amazing people if you just go search for @Unbeatable Podcast on pretty much any of those social media platforms out there. you're going to find people like Wayne Merca. Wayne is our fan of the week this week. And Wayne, I just want to say you're amazing. That's why we call you our fan of the week this week. Thanks for tuning in and listening to this episode. If you are struggling, if you need a little pick-me-up, if you're overwhelmed and need some motivation to get you through some challenges, if you're facing difficulties and you need a little help being unbeatable, I got a totally free resource. I call it the Unbeatable Army Survival Guide. It's a PDF. It's totally free. I'll give it to you if you'll just simply go over and become part of the Unbeatable Army. Just go ahead and check it out at unbeatablearmy.com. Thanks for joining me for this very special Veterans Day Saving My Enemies broadcast. See you next week.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.